You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron, live with Ethan Haristodoulou.
What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the Greeks Gridiron. I'm Ethan Haristodoulou, and today I am talking the Philadelphia Eagles and how I would like to see them attack this year's free agency. I'll be going over somebody I'd like to see them let go, somebody I think they must re-sign, and a player that I would like to see them target in this free agency class. So my Eagles fans, comment down below. Let me know what you want to see from your Eagles team going into this offseason and into free agency. But we're going to dive right in, starting off with who I think this Eagles team needs to let go. And it's got to be defensive end Robert Quinn. I don't really think that this is one that's up in the air either. I know they traded a fourth-round selection to get him this past season during that trade deadline period there. And I've got to say, Robert Quinn to me was a really exciting pickup. This is somebody that was coming off of an 18.5 sack season just last year. Then he comes to Philly. You think, okay, the season didn't necessarily start off great for him. He only had a sack so far leading into the trade to the Eagles. He ends up only playing 88 snaps. He missed 5 games, and ultimately his stat line for while he was on the Eagles, when you take away everything he did with Chicago this year, 2 tackles and a quarterback hit. That is not the production I think that the Eagles thought they were getting when they traded that fourth-round selection for him, and I've got to assume that they're probably a little disappointed with how that turned out. That is, again, a steep decline. We're talking 18.5 sacks last season, a quiet 18.5 sacks. I really thought when they made this trade for him that he was going to be a massive difference maker, and if I'm feeling disappointed about how that trade turned out, and I'm not even an Eagles fan, I'm sure that Eagles brass is probably feeling somewhat the same, if not more. With $13 million in cap space eaten up by him this past season, I don't necessarily know what his number is going to be if they were to try to bring him back. I'm assuming it's going to have to be well below that number, but ultimately, I think that this is one that the Eagles just kind of need to move on from. There's a handful of guys on the D-line that, because of age and just where they are in production-wise, you're probably going to end up losing a couple of guys here, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the video, but Robert Quinn just seems like a guy that, you made the trade for him. Yeah, you gave up a fourth-round pick, but for whatever reason, be it just because he was hurting, scheme fit did not work for him, he just wasn't getting the playing time he needed, I don't know, but a woeful trade and not near any of the results you wanted to get out of him. I think that you move on from Robert Quinn, let him walk, and see where he goes in free agency. Now, for the person that I want to see the Eagles re-sign here, I'll be completely honest with you, I really didn't put much thought into this one here because I had a person in mind as soon as I sat down to prep out this video for you. And it has got to be safety CJ Gardner-Johnson. You want to talk about an absolute home run of a pickup last offseason. If you are not bringing Gardner-Johnson back, what on earth are you doing, Philadelphia? Again, I know we're $2 million and some change over the cap. It's going to be a little tough, especially with how good of a season he had, but it is very clear to me that CJ Gardner-Johnson really figured it out in this system over in Philadelphia. He became a legit guy, a voice. He had the attitude, that brash arrogance, but he backed it up with the play that he had on the field. This is someone that I want to see back in Philadelphia. He did miss 5 games, so because of that, you do have a little bit of leverage. I'm curious to see if Gardner-Johnson's willing to take any sort of a home team discount type of deal. I know he's only been in Philly for 1 year, but it sounds like he's really loved Philadelphia, and I know you Philly fans have embraced him. The guy had 67 tackles on the year, 6 picks, 8 passes defense. You do not want to give that up. So if I am the Eagles, you have a guy who's young, 25 years old, and he clearly excelled in your system. You are doing everything in your power to bring this guy back. You're going to have to let some guys walk this year in free agency. There's going to have to be some salary remanagement, or not remanagement, adjusting, I guess you should say. That would probably be the correct word. But for somebody that just looked so good and I feel like fits Philadelphia to an absolute T, and Philly fans, please tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like CJ Gardner-Johnson is an Eagle. He is a guy for Philly, someone that fans can get behind. It would just be devastating, in my opinion, to see him not in a Philadelphia uniform next season. So, Eagles, if you're listening, bring back Gardner-Johnson. The kid is a stud. He's 25 and playing as one of the better safeties in the league. Come on. Now, for my third person to talk about here, this is my pickup for the Eagles. And this was one that I actually really had to put some thought in because, again, like I've mentioned a few times already, Not necessarily the most money in the world if you were the Philadelphia Eagles in terms of cap space right now. You're going to have to do some reworking, open up some cap space. And again, I expect to see some aging veterans have to walk because of the salary cap situation over there. And you're also preparing to pay Jalen Hurts what I'm assuming to be a massive contract because the dude is an absolute beast. I think that with the potential to be losing, and like I mentioned, I already said you're letting Robert Quinn walk in my scenario here. On top of that, Brandon Graham and Fletcher Cox, both being large numbers on the salary cap this past season, I believe about it was like 13 million or so for both the players. You're going to have to see one of those guys potentially go as well. They're not getting any younger and they're starting to age, so somebody is going to have to be let go. And I'm assuming that D-line, if you look at the right people in free agency, you could actually get some pretty good value out of. Now, one name that I came across, and as I'm like looking around, I kept coming back to this guy, and I felt like, you know what? I feel like this makes a lot of sense. He's coming from New Orleans. He played in a 4-3 system over there. Eagles, base 4-3 as well. Kentavius Street, defensive lineman. You probably hear that name and you're like, who the hell is this guy? Not necessarily, an in-house name or anything like that. Something that, you're someone you're talking about week in and week out. However, hear me out on this one. My goal with the guy that I was targeting for free agency when I was trying to pick a guy for the Eagles here, I'm looking for value, but I'm also looking for pretty solid production as well. This is a guy that's probably going to be more of a rotational piece, and I was looking for someone that's hanging around like the 50 snap range or so. Again, not a guy that you expect to start and be an absolute force on the D-line, but someone to help try to mitigate some of the losses you're going to probably be taking on the D-line this offseason. So then I come across Kentavius Street. He logged 517 snaps this past season for New Orleans. He played 372 of those snaps in the B gap, 104 of those in the A gap. So a little bit of versatility for him. You can line him up in a few different places, and he has found some decent success. This past season, most recently, 3.5 sacks. He had 5 tackles for loss, 29 tackles. He had 8 QB hits. Again, solid production. You would have been thrilled compared to what you got out of Robert Quinn if you even got those numbers out of him this past season. So Kentavius Street, a guy you can bring in, and again, a rotational piece. You don't need him to play a ton. If he's only in for 50 to 45% of the time in terms of defensive snaps, that's awesome. And if you get this type of production, he was only being paid $1.2 million or so last season. That is an absolute bargain. Again, you dished out, and not necessarily you per se, because I know some of that money was split up between the Bears and the Eagles here, but you're looking at like $13 million that was paid to Robert Quinn for 2 tackles and what was the other number there, and a quarterback hit. If you can get him, let's say for, 2-3 million, maybe 4 million at most to help shore up and add in some of the depth there on that D line, where are you going wrong here? And who knows, being alongside some really good players on the defensive line, you have Javon Hargrave, you have Josh Sweat, and he's playing alongside those guys, maybe he finds himself in better position to make more plays. I'm not going to sit here and diss the Saints defensive front, but over the years, they've been kind of slowly losing players here and there. Obviously, Trey Hendrickson's over in Cincinnati now, and some of the other players are starting to age out, and maybe they're not as imposing as they were a few years back. But this Eagles D-line has had a lot of depth. They've had some really good young players on there, or younger-ish guys, for the last few years now. And again, you're trying to figure out how do we mitigate the loss of potentially losing Fletcher Cox or Brandon Graham, or maybe you even lose both. Cheap, production, and value. That was my biggest thing here when I was looking at this pickup, and I think that he would be an excellent addition for the Philadelphia Eagles defense. Not too much money, but a guy who can be there that you can count on for like 45 to 50% of the snaps coming up this next season, because he's been relatively healthy, and just even the season prior, he had 4 sacks the year before. Solid production for a low cost. But that is what I think of when I'm looking at the Eagles for this year's free agency. My Eagles fans, let me know in the comment section. What am I getting right? What am I getting wrong? What would you like to see from the Eagles in free agency this year? I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions. But that's it for me. I appreciate you for hanging out. See you all next time. Have a good one.